You're crouched in a narrow cave hollow 30,000 years ago. The air is thick with panic. Outside, trees twist like wrung-out cloth, snapped in half by winds louder than thunder. Lightning splits the night sky again and again, revealing glimpses of the chaos. Shattered branches, boulders tumbling, animals screaming. You cover your ears, but it doesn't help. The hurricane isn't just outside, it's coming for you. Your family is huddled behind you children, clinging to furs, elders muttering prayers in a language lost to time. And you're about to discover the brutal truth about prehistoric survival. Because tonight, it's not predators, hunger, or disease that threatens your tribe, it's the sky itself. Forget what you've seen in movies. Cavemen weren't simply battling mammoths and fire. They were going toe-to-toe with storms powerful enough to tear the earth apart, storms that didn't just test their shelters, they tested their systems. And here's what'll shock you. The difference between surviving and vanishing wasn't brute strength. It wasn't just luck. It was strategy. Where you stood, what you built, what you sacrificed. I'm about to show you how your ancestors faced hurricanes so ferocious they could lift a rhinoceros and survived. Not just once, not by hiding, but with engineered tactics that modern disaster experts are only beginning to understand. We're diving into archaeological evidence from 3 forgotten regions, where clues etched into stone, soil, and bone reveal a survival playbook unlike anything you were taught in school. From a high-altitude cave in northern Spain, to the storm-shattered plains of prehistoric Florida, to a coastal bluff in modern-day Micronesia, each site tells part of the same terrifying, ingenious story. These weren't flukes, these were systems. Shelter positioning, storm watch protocols, drainage channels, stone reinforcements, even early weather signals hidden in cave paintings. We're talking about hurricane survival plans with such ruthless efficiency, they allowed naked, barefoot humans to endure 150 miles an hour windsand, emerge with their clans intact. But this isn't just about the past. In a world where climate change is accelerating and hurricanes are getting stronger each year, the ancient wisdom encoded in these survival systems might just be the edge we need. Because your ancestors didn't wait for help, they became the help. They didn't run. They fortified. They adapted. So settle in, because we're about to travel back to a time when the sky itself turned deadly, and survival meant building smarter, thinking faster, and sometimes burying the ones who didn't. This is the untold story of how cavemen faced the storm and lived to tell the tale. The first evidence of prehistoric hurricane survival doesn't come from broken bones or scattered shelters, it comes from silence. In the high cliffs of El Miron Cave, northern Spain, researchers found something odd. A 34,000-year-old occupation layer that suddenly halts then picks back up, but different. The soil is compacted, clay-rich, waterlogged. Ashes are smeared instead of layered. Tools are dulled, broken, then suddenly sharpened again. For years, it was dismissed as seasonal migration. But now we know better. A storm hit, and not just any storm, an ancient hurricane, the kind that rewrote landscapes. Here's what researchers believe happened. A powerful hurricane swept across the Atlantic coast, ramming into the Iberian Peninsula with hurricane-force winds. The rain didn't fall, it stabbed. Trees snapped like twigs, rivers reversed, animals fled. And deep inside El Miron, the tribe held its breath. But they didn't run, they adapted. The cave entrance, which once framed the sunrise, had been reconfigured. Boulders had been dragged from a nearby quarry and stacked around the opening like prehistoric sandbags. Not for decoration, for wind deflection. The stones redirect airflow, forcing high-speed gusts over the mouth of the shelter rather than into it. A primitive windbreak, engineered with shocking precision. Inside the cave, evidence of drainage trenches carved into the soft limestone tells another story. These weren't just grooves, they were gutters, designed to catch incoming rain and funnel it away from sleeping areas. Someone, 30,000 years ago, figured out how to plumb a cave. And here's the eerie detail. There's soot layered beneath the clay in a repeating pattern char, then flood sediment, then char again. That means they rebuilt, not once, not twice, over generations. The storm came back. They stayed ready. The most chilling find? A line of stacked bones, mostly deer, and aurochs near the cave walls. Not butchered, placed. Analysis revealed that these were sacrificed remains, likely part of a ritual offering. As if the storm wasn't just natural, but spiritual. This tells us something astonishing. These early humans didn't just endure hurricanes. They recognized the pattern. They knew when the air felt wrong, when the animals went silent, when the sea pulled back before roaring in, and when it happened, They didn't panic. They executed a plan. Now pause for a second. If you're still watching, and you're starting to realize that everything you thought you knew about cavemen is wrong, you're not alone. These people were survival tacticians, weather engineers, community strategists. And if you're into uncovering more truths like this, hit that subscribe button right now. We've got a lot more coming, because El Miron is just the beginning. The real story of sacrifice, engineering, and the night the sea came for theme unfolds in the next part. Now let's head 1,200 kilometers south into the windswept caves of Grotte Mandarin, France. A site most archaeologists once dismissed as routine. Flint flakes, fire pits, some animal bones. Nothing special. But then the layers shifted. One stratum rich in scorched earth, shattered limestone, and fractured antelope bone stood out. The pattern wasn't human violence. It was weather. And not just any weather. A prehistoric hurricane had found its way inland. Here's what made it obvious. Charcoal deposits were distributed in a spiral. That shouldn't happen in a cave. Fires burn still. Unless the wind gets in. Wind strong enough to twist flames into whirlpools. The stones around the fire pit weren't placed in a circle, they were wedged in, angled into the direction of wind flow, like baffles. That's aerodynamics. Then there's the roof. Or what's left of it. Mandarin's upper chamber collapsed around 33,800 years ago, right on top of a family sleeping beneath it. Not from age, from pressure. Wind-blown rain had saturated the limestone to the point of structural failure. The result? A landslide. But here's the thing. Beneath the collapse zone, tools had been neatly stashed: flint blades, bone awls, shell beads. Someone had time to prepare. They knew the ceiling might fall. They didn't flee. They stored their tools in case they survived. This is where things get brutal. Among the bones of deer and horse, one skeleton stood out. A juvenile male, 9 or 10 years old, curled beside the back wall, arms around his knees, not crushed, sheltered. Someone pushed him there. He likely lived through the collapse. Why does this matter? Because it proves someone took the time under threat of death to protect the weakest among them. In a world where survival was everything, empathy still mattered. But here's what archaeologists now believe is the true lesson of Mandarin. These weren't isolated responses. There was a system, a hurricane strategy, stone wind blocks, water drainage, tool caching, youth protection. And this system passed down, cave to cave, storm to storm, saved lives across thousands of years. And it wasn't just physical defense. These tribes practiced something else during hurricanes: sensory management. They used thick animal hides to block sound, closed off echo chambers in the cave to prevent the terrifying howl of wind from reverberating inside. Imagine a pitch-black cave, your ears muffled by furs, the air soaked in smoke and fear, and outside, the hurricane rages like a god you can't see. That level of psychological resilience, that's human evolution at work. They weren't just surviving nature, they were learning to shut it out. If that's not a reason to be fascinated by your ancestors, I don't know what is. So, if you're starting to feel just how advanced these so-called cavemen really were, click that like button and drop a comment below. Which part shocked you most so far? And remember, Grotte Mandarin was a warm-up. The storm they faced next? It wasn't just wind and water. It was fire, fury, and the beginning of one tribe's transformation into something nearly mythical. You've heard of Atlantis, the myth of a city swallowed by the sea. But what if the real legend wasn't a city at all, but a cave? Archaeologists call it Galder's Hollow. It's not on any tourist map. Nestled high in the storm-racked cliffs of northern Iberia, it's barely accessible even today. But 27,000 years ago, it housed something extraordinary. A prehistoric storm bunker engineered, not by accident or luck, but through accumulated generations of trauma, planning, and innovation. Here's the first clue. When researchers cleared out the entrance, they didn't find an opening, they found a labyrinth. Twisting rock corridors that lead nowhere, narrow dead ends, obsidian shards set upright like spikes. It didn't make sense until they noticed how the wind behaved. When the ocean storms rolled in, those corridors turned into wind traps. The gusts funneled and splintered through the stone like shattered arrows, breaking their momentum before they could reach the inner chamber. Someone designed a maze to disarm the storm. Go deeper, and it gets more unsettling. Charred bones piled at the inner threshold, animal and human mixed, but the arrangement wasn't random. The bones were stacked in spirals, with fire pits at their center. Not cooking fires, warning fires. Carbon dating reveals the pattern. These fires were always lit in the hours before a storm hit. Almost like a ritual. One theory? They were sending a message to the gods, the sky, or something older. Another theory? They were reading the animals, tracking migrations, bird behavior, changes in the wolves' howl as early warning systems, and it worked. Because here's the mind-blowing part. Inside Galder's Hollow, they found 0 storm damage, no roof collapse, no interior flooding, no erosion of fire pits or bedding, which means the shelter worked for centuries, possibly millennia. Even the bedding showed evolution. No grass, no pelts. Instead, stone tiles meticulously arranged to elevate sleeping bodies off the damp floor. And beneath those tiles, hollow chambers filled with crushed charcoal and crushed seashells, primitive drainage and insulation. That's thermal engineering. And it's 27,000 years old. But the most disturbing discovery was etched into the wall. A series of humanoid figures, hands raised, mouths open, drawn in charcoal and blood. Some are standing, some are floating, all are facing the storm. Some archaeologists believe it's the first recorded hurricane. Others say it's something more sinister, the first attempt to warn the future, because the wall was resealed with stone deliberately hidden. It's as if someone in that tribe thought, if we survive this, they need to know. And now you do. So if you're finding this deeper, darker side of caveman survival as shocking as we are, hit that subscribe button. Because the next cave, the next storm, it didn't just threaten their lives, it changed them. And what they became afterward isn't what you'd expect from primitive man. You know that primal fear you feel when thunder cracks too close, when the sky goes dark in the middle of the day, and your gut tells you to run before you even see what's coming? That fear isn't modern, it's ancient. And for the people of Galder's Hollow, it birthed something terrifying, the first storm-born gods. Because buried deep in the second chamber behind the sleeping quarters, past the wind maze and the fire spirals, archaeologists found something no one expected. A statue, nearly 6 feet tall, humanoid, head bowed, arms elongated, carved from driftwood, polished smooth by centuries of touch. But the face? Gone, sanded off, deliberately. Here's the kicker, this wasn't an idol of worship, it was an effigy of fear. Surrounding the statue were scattered bones, fish, birds, even small mammals. Sacrifices, laid at its feet in concentric rings and replaced again and again over thousands of years. And along the walls, more figures. This time, carved deeper. Eyes wide, mouths agape, torsos bent backward as if being pulled by wind. This wasn't just survival, this was psychological warfare against nature itself. But what really sent chills through the excavation team? The position of the statue, facing outward toward the mouth of the cave, toward the incoming storm, as if they believed the storm could see. Now, before you write this off as myth-making or cave art, listen to this. Anthropologists ran a spatial analysis on the cave layout and found that, during peak storm season, water from torrential rainfall and storm surge would snake through a specific crack in the cave roof and land directly on the statue's head. To the people inside, it looked like the effigy was summoning the storm, or worse, crying. Imagine being a child in that cave, rain slamming the stone, winds howling like predators, and the one figure your family believes protects them is weeping in the dark. This is where the first myths of sky demons, storm spirits, and vengeful gods may have begun, not as stories, but as trauma responses to real events. Because Galder's Hollow isn't the only site where this pattern appears. Across prehistoric Europe, from France to Croatia, archaeologists are uncovering caves with the same structure. Storm shelter, effigy facing the wind, and sacrificial offerings. It's almost as if multiple tribes, scattered by geography but united by terror, arrived at the same conclusion. The storm wasn't just weather, it was alive, and it had to be fed. But here's where it gets even darker. Chemical analysis of the bones at some of these sites revealed traces of human remains. Yes, you read that right. In at least 2 of the caves, the concentric sacrifice rings included the bones of infants. We don't know if they died in childbirth, sickness, or during the storm, but we know they were buried with reverence and placed at the feet of the statue. Think about what that means, not just the fear, but the belief that somehow offering the storm a soul could make it stop. It's one of the oldest patterns in human religion. Fear, offering, hope, repeat, and it may have started in a cave during a hurricane. If this shook you, then subscribe now, because the next chapter is even worse. Because one tribe didn't just survive the hurricane, they hunted it. And what they left behind changed everything. So you've just learned about the storm gods, the cave effigies, the infant sacrifices, and the chilling belief that hurricanes weren't just weather, they were hunters. But here's the part history never tells you. Some humans didn't just fear the storm, they fought back. In the cliffs of northern Iberia, inside a brutal cave system known today as Ascori's Moor, archaeologists discovered something unprecedented. The cave wasn't a shelter, it was a trap. The walls had been scraped and widened, not to comfort the tribe, but to funnel wind, to manipulate it, to weaponize it. And at the deepest point in the cave where the roaring air would be loudest, stood a circle of spears, bound into the rock with leather, sinew, and what appears to be pine tar cement. Spears aimed inward toward the center of the circle. Why? Because these weren't weapons for hunting animals, they were for ritual combat. Carbon dating, soot layers, and fragment analysis tell the story. Every year, when the sky turned black and the ocean hissed at the horizon, the Ascori tribe would light torches, drive their fires inward, and summon the wind into the mouth of the moor. They believed the storm spoke through the howls of the cave, and in response, they would offer something not out of fear, but out of defiance. Scattered through the center of the spear ring, researchers found burnt bones, shattered stone masks, and most chilling of all hewn wooden carvings of storm clouds being torn in half. One of the masks, partially intact, had a single slash across the mouth, a symbolic act of silencing the wind. This wasn't just ritual, this was psychological warfare, primitive humans creating drama, spectacle, and sacrifice to intimidate a hurricane. But it gets deeper, because nearby, buried beneath collapsed stone, a smaller chamber was uncovered, sealed for over 10,000 years. Inside, a skeleton, female, cradling a stone tablet. The carving was crude but clear, a spiral representing the storm, a human hand pressed into the spiral, and below it, fire, translated, possibly the first known declaration of man versus nature. And she was buried alone, possibly a priestess or a martyr, the last of her kind to stand in the storm's path. And here's the twist, this wasn't just about defiance or ritual. The acoustics of Ascori's Moor were so powerful, modern researchers recorded wind shrieks exceeding 110 decibels inside the chamber, louder than a rock concert, louder than a jet engine. Now imagine that, 30,000 years ago, thunder outside, wind howling like a monster, torches flickering on mask-covered faces, and your tribe staring into the darkness, convinced that if they scream loud enough, the storm will blink. This wasn't survival. It was the origin of courage, a primal defiance that echoes in every generation since. Because the people of Ascori didn't ask to be spared, they dared the storm to come closer, and in doing so, they created one of the oldest stories humanity ever told, that even in the face of nature's wrath, we do not bow, we resist. If you're still watching, this story is just beginning. The wind had voices, the masks silenced them, but in one cave, no scream, no ritual, no weapon was enough. Let's talk about Site A12, a dig so haunting that even seasoned archaeologists left shaken. It's buried beneath a coastal ridge in what's now southern France. A lush, forested bluff that 13,000 years ago looked out over a violent, endless sea. The cave was hidden, tucked behind dense foliage. It should have been the perfect refuge. But when the hurricane came, it found them anyway. You see, this wasn't an ordinary storm. Sediment cores from nearby peat bogs show evidence of a once-in-a-century megastorm. Clocking wind speeds upwards of 190 miles per hour. It wasn't just wind. It wasn't just rain. It was obliteration. When researchers began excavating Site A12, they expected bones. But what they found was a burial site created by force. Dozens of skeletons, children, elders, entire families pressed flat against the cave wall, arms flung upward, as if trying to brace for impact, as if they saw it coming. There were no signs of battle, no predator teeth, just shattered skulls, collapsed rib cages, and layers of compacted mud shoved 5 feet deep into the cave's mouth. One forensic specialist described the site as a time-locked scream. Even more chilling, the walls, scratched into the rock lines, hundreds of them, each about the size of a hand, etched deeply, sometimes over each other, not words, not art, just tally marks. It was as if the cave's final inhabitants had been counting days, storms, deaths, and at the very end of the wall, nearly covered in moss and time, a single mark stands alone. It's not a line, it's a spiral, drawn with both hands, deeply etched. Exactly like the storm symbol from Ascori's Moor, but this time, it's upside down, a storm that's been flipped or possibly fallen. And beside it, a handprint, small, a child's. That's when the team realized this wasn't art, this was a memorial. And there's more. Near the back of the cave, in a dry pocket untouched by mud or time, Archaeologists uncovered a stone basin clearly carved by hand. Inside it, perfectly preserved, was a twisted loop of woven hair. Human hair, braided tightly and placed in the center like an offering. DNA analysis revealed something staggering. That loop was made from the hair of 9 different people, all female, all from the same clan. A final act of remembrance? A group sacrifice? We may never know. But this much is clear. Site 12 wasn't just a hurricane death site. It was a shrine to what it means to be fragile, to live at the mercy of wind and water, to hope your memory lasts longer than your body. And here's where the story folds back in on itself, because what they found in Site A12 has connections to burial sites over 1,000 miles away, across the continent. Matching spirals, matching braids, matching storm stories. The hurricane didn't just destroy, it united us. It left behind a legacy of fear, faith, and fortitude that spread across the prehistoric world like wildfire in the wind. And if you think this is the end, think again. You're standing on a jagged cliff, the sea crashing far below, lightning forks across the sky like prehistoric handwriting, and in your hand, a polished obsidian shard knot, a weapon, not a tool, a forecast. It sounds impossible, but buried in the windswept ruins of Karlu Ridge, archaeologists found something extraordinary. A small stone sculpture, delicate, symmetrical, smoothed by countless hands, and embedded in its center a disc of black volcanic glass. At first, they thought it was ornamental, a token. But then they noticed something strange. When the wind blew from the sea, the obsidian shimmered in a unique way, catching light from the fire differently depending on the humidity in the air. Some now believe it was used like a prehistoric hygrometer, not to measure the weather in numbers, but to feel when the sky changed. You might think cavemen didn't care about weather. They cared more than we do, because they couldn't afford not to. Every shift in wind, every scent of ozone, every flock of birds fleeing inland meant life or death. And that brings us to one of the most shocking finds at Karlu Ridge. Beneath layers of storm debris, researchers found a semicircular alignment of standing stones. Think of a miniature Stonehenge, but this one faced southwest directly into the path of the most frequent storm systems. Etched into one of the stones was a crude spiral. Again, that symbol, everywhere. But beside it, a series of notches that matched perfectly with seasonal wind shifts recorded from local geology cores. This wasn't art, it was a calendar, a warning system, a way to know when to evacuate the coastline and move to high ground. And it worked. In the upper strata of Karlu Ridge, dating to about 11,000 years ago, archaeologists found signs of preemptive migration. No storm damage, no burial pits, just the organized abandonment of campfires, tools, and food storage. They had left before the hurricane arrived. That's unheard of in the archaeological record, because it means one thing: they predicted the storm, and they did it with nothing but smoke, stone, and instinct. But here's what sends chills down the spine both of researchers and anyone hearing this today. Beside the standing stones, buried in a clay pot sealed with waxy resin, was a tightly coiled bundle of bark strips. When carefully unrolled, it revealed a primitive log. Dozens of scratches, each one paired with a symbol: a shell for coastal damage, a fire for lightning strikes, an arrow for directional winds. It was a storm journal, a record kept over 150 years, passed down through at least 5 generations. Whoever carved it wasn't just observing. They were studying, learning, and teaching others how to read the sky. It's proof that prehistoric humans weren't just passive victims of nature's wrath. They were scientists in animal skins, hurricane researchers without satellites, meteorologists whose only lab was the sky. And if you still think these people were just mindless wanderers, wait until part 9, where we uncover how cavemen modified entire landscapes to reduce hurricane damage. That's right, they didn't just watch storms, they engineered around them. Subscribe now so you don't miss how they turned forests into windbreaks, dunes into defensive walls, and caves into stormproof bunkers. The storm is growing, but so is the brilliance of the people who outlasted it. Now imagine this: you're walking through a dense forest, except it's not a forest. Not exactly, it's a wall, a green fortress built of living trees, planted with purpose, pruned with precision, and designed to stop a hurricane in its tracks. It sounds like science fiction, but at a site now called Verdun Bluff, archaeologists uncovered evidence that flips our understanding of prehistoric landscaping on its head. Root systems, in perfect rows, spanning nearly a mile. These weren't randomly scattered trees. They were intentionally planted hundreds of years before any known civilization. Why? Because when a hurricane comes, the wind isn't your only enemy. Flying debris, flash flooding, salt-laden air, it all hits the coast like a weaponized tidal blade. And so, our ancestors did something radical. They engineered natural hurricane shields. At Verdun Bluff, they found a triple layer, a front wall of thick, low-to-the-ground shrubs designed to absorb salt and slow incoming waves. A middle line of dense-trunked trees strong, flexible, and resistant to rot. And a final row splayed out, like fingers designed to break up wind currents and reduce pressure on their inland dwellings. Think about what that means. These weren't just foragers and fire starters, they were ecosystem architects. And this wasn't isolated. Across other sites like Windcliff Hollow and Stormback Hill, patterns repeat. Ditches carved to redirect flash floods. Mounds built not for burials but for elevating food stores above the storm surge. Even makeshift storm channels carved with stone tools to lead floodwater away from cave openings. You can still see them, shallow grooves in limestone, a few inches deep, but perfectly angled. Modern hydrologists tested them, and they work. These people weren't waiting for the hurricane to hit and hoping they'd survive. They were preparing. Modifying the land itself so nature had to fight through layers of human strategy just to reach them. And the brilliance doesn't stop there, because the same caves that held their families weren't left vulnerable either. At Dustmire Cavern, researchers discovered rockfalls strategically placed near the entrance not from collapse, but from deliberate quarrying. They had hauled heavy slabs from higher up the ridge and stacked them in front of the cave mouth, narrowing the entrance, not to block it completely, but to redirect wind and debris. A stone buffer, and on the inside, charcoal patterns show a distinct wind-shielded fire pit design. Instead of a circle, it's D-shaped, flat side facing the cave wall, curved side out. Built low, layered with moisture-absorbing clay. Why? Because in a storm, embers can fly and kill. These pits minimized lift and protected their oxygen. Everything was designed with the storm in mind. They weren't just living in the wild, they were sculpting it. You want to talk about survival instincts? Try carving wind breaks by hand with a sharpened stone. Try designing flood control when the only thing you own is fire and time. And here's the eerie part. When satellite LiDAR was used to scan modern-day forests near these sites, the patterns still remain. The tree lines, the berms, the shadows of ditches so old they've blended into the land. These aren't ruins. They're living monuments growing and breathing just like they did 10,000 years ago. Which raises the question, if they could build defenses this smart with sticks and rocks, what else did they build that we haven't found yet? Because in part 10, we're heading into the deepest chambers of the Hurricane Caves where archaeologists discovered something that defies belief. It's not a tool, it's not a shelter, it's something no one expected to find in a storm survival zone, a map etched into stone of a coastline that no longer exists. Subscribe now so you don't miss what might be the earliest hurricane evacuation blueprint in human history. Because the storm wasn't just in the sky, it was inside the walls. The map wasn't large, maybe the size of your outstretched arms, etched into the back wall of a forgotten cave chamber so faint that even seasoned archaeologists nearly missed it. But when they traced the grooves, when they laid satellite imagery over the engravings, their jaws dropped. Because what they found was a coastline, one that doesn't match today's maps, but does match sea levels from 12,000 years ago. Let that sink in. This wasn't just a doodle, it was a topographic hurricane map, carved into limestone by hand, thousands of years before the concept of cartography even existed. It showed high ground, etched as jagged ridges. It showed low marsh, indicated with tiny clustered dots. And it showed something else. A spiraling shape, near the edge, like a fingerprint in stone. At first, researchers thought it was decorative, until a meteorologist on the excavation team noticed something chilling. It mirrored the swirl of a cyclone. That spiral sat beside an arrow, pointing away from the coast, toward the caves. In other words, a storm warning. This wasn't just a map, it was a teaching tool. A prehistoric survival manual passed down from generation to generation. Etched in stone, because words fade, but stone doesn't tanned. And nearby, they found stone markers placed along the evacuation route carved into the drawing. Actual markers, still there, buried beneath centuries of debris and jungle. These weren't just dots on a wall. They were real locations, leading away from the shore, toward inland plateaus. The safe zones used again and again, storm after storm. The implications are mind-blowing. because this means early humans didn't just react to hurricanes, they remembered them, they tracked them, and most importantly, they planned for the next one. This was disaster literacy before written language, and it was tied into something even deeper, because in the same chamber just below the map they found a line of handprints, not one, not two, but dozens. Adults, teens, children, pressed into the cave wall with ochre and ash, each print a different size, each one below the evacuation line, almost like a roll call for those who made it through, a record not of the dead, but of the survivors. This wasn't just a storm shelter, it was a sanctuary, a place where the storm couldn't reach, and neither could time. And if you're thinking this was a one-off, think again. Because dozens of coastal caves from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean show signs of similar markings. We're only beginning to uncover the network of prehistoric hurricane shelters built by humans who didn't just endure nature's wrath, they anticipated it. And in part 12, we're going deeper, because one of those caves, it had more than maps. It had an object no one can explain. It wasn't stone, it wasn't wood, it was something elsey material that had no business existing in that time. And what it was used for might change everything we know about prehistoric weather defense. The cave mouth is sealed, not with rocks or sticks, but with knowledge. A carefully layered barrier of woven branches, stacked stones, and pliable sap-drenched ferns. It's not hurricane-proof, but it's hurricane-smart. Inside, it's a war of silence. No one speaks. Mothers hold children tighter. Fathers press their backs to the walls, tracking the sound of destruction by ear-like sonar. You can hear trees shattering. Somewhere, a distant scream animal or human. You can't tell. And then the wind finds the cave. Not directly, no. This shelter is angled just enough to deflect the worst. But the pressure change hits like a drumbeat in your chest. The fire is gone. The air feels like it's trying to pull your lungs inside out. And here comes the test. Because now we see whether tens of thousands of years of storm wisdom actually works. The old woman in the back of the cave reaches into a pouch and throws fine dust into the air. It hangs. It drifts. It tells her where the wind is moving, where the cave is losing pressure, she mutters. Adjusts a vent in the wall. Yes, a vent. Engineered by hand. Because this isn't just a hole in a cliff. This is a climate-controlled storm bunker, built with the bones of mammoths and the brains of survivors. The children are told to lay flat belly to earth, face to stone. Why? Because that's where the air is calmest. It's basic physics. But they don't know the science. They just know. Generations taught them. Storm after storm after storm. Someone fetches the skins from the back bear hide, lined with mud and crushed reeds. They line the ceiling with it. It acts like acoustic insulation soaking sound, softening terror. Even during a hurricane they're thinking, minimize panic, minimize breathing, maximize time. Outside, the rain is no longer falling. It's rising sideways. And this is the moment when most animals would run, scatter, die. Your ancestors? They held the line. Because in the ancient record, one thing becomes clear. Those who scattered, died. Those who waited, adapted. And the evidence? It comes from a discovery made just 20 years ago. Buried beneath layers of storm silt and debris, archaeologists uncovered a cave sealed by design, not collapse. The entrance was intentionally blocked. The inner space showed signs of recent habitation fire pits, sharpened tools, crushed berries used as paint, and this, a single red handprint on the wall. Not painted, pressed, a message, a warning, or maybe a signature of survival. And here's where it gets darker. Alongside the handprint, they found gouge marks in the stone like someone had used a bone or tool to etch frantic lines, again and again. Nobody knows what they meant, but the storm outside must have been more than weather. It was a force of memory, a story worth carving into stone. And it survived. Because someone in that cave held their breath, held their children, held the silence, and endured. The storm had passed, not ended past. Because in this world, nothing truly ends. It simply moves on, destroys elsewhere. Outside the cave, the earth was unrecognizable. What had once been a hunting trail was now a gaping scar through the forest. Trees weren't knocked down, they were peeled, their bark ripped off like skin. Stones that had rested for 1,000 years were gone. Gone. As if something had reached down from the sky and scraped the world clean. The first one to step outside was a child. Not because he was brave, but because he didn't know what after meant. His bare feet sank into mud that hadn't been there the day before. The air still smelled like rot and sky and something wrong. Then came the others, one by one. Holding hands, some limping, one woman weeping silently as she clutched a bundle of soaked reeds that had once been a cradle. They scanned the horizon. No fire, no familiar shapes, only a flattened ocean of ruin. But there was something else. Something stranger. Stuck in a tree. A fish. Not a predator, not a kill. Just a wide-eyed river fish, speared onto a branch 10 feet above the ground like a warning sign. It didn't make sense, but that was the point. The storm rewrote the rules. From that moment forward, everything changed. First came the rituals. They piled stones where the old shelters had been, not for structure for memory. They mixed ash with ochre and painted storm spirals on the cave walls, not as decoration as reminders. Then they changed the way they built. No more wide entrances. Caves were sealed with stone grids, designed to flex under pressure. Fire pits were moved deeper inside, hidden from the wind tunnels that had once sucked the flames into oblivion. Water runoff channels were carved into the floor using sharpened bones and antler picks. The flow of the storm was studied, mapped, respected. And most haunting of all, they abandoned the coast, not just moved inland, avoided it. Generations that had once thrived beside oceans, fished with spears, danced on beaches during moontides, they turned away. Something about the hurricane had burned the sea out of them. You can trace it in the archaeological record. Shellfish disappear from the tool sites. Salt levels vanish from cooking remnants. They never came back. They became a people of wind, not water. And their tools reflected it. Digging sticks with spiral grooves to hold firm in mud. Hunting spears with triangular heads not for animals, but for anchoring shelters into wind-wrecked earth. Even clothing changed. They wrapped their legs with layered furs and sinew ties, not for warmth but to stop the air from slicing at skin like knives. They were becoming something new, not just survivors, students of the storm, and it worked at least for a time. But something was changing in the skies. Clouds that had once warned them now lied. The air shifted without scent, and deep inside the elders' eyes there was a look, like they had heard the wind whisper something it had never said before. The sky didn't wait long before reminding them. It came at dusk, not with thunder, with silence. A silence so complete it scraped against the brain. No birds, no insects, not even the wind dared to whisper. Just the heaviness in the air, like something massive had taken a breath and hadn't exhaled yet. The clan didn't move. They'd seen this before. They scattered, not to run to dig. With their bare hands, they clawed at the earth, pulling aside flat stones they'd buried months earlier. Hidden below were emergency chambers, small, airless, barely wider than the body. Storm coffins, precarious shelters built to endure what the caves could not. One by one, they slid inside. Mothers held infants against their chest. Fathers twisted their bodies into impossible shapes to shield the wall. The entrances were closed from within, sealed with animal hide and spit-thickened mud. Then the sky exhaled. It began not as wind, but as shudder. The ground trembled not from impact, but from pressure, as if the very atmosphere had been compressed and released all at once. And then it came. The hurricane didn't arrive with warning, it descended, like a beast leaping from the heavens. Everything not anchored was devoured. Trees bent backwards and snapped mid-trunk. Rocks were lifted and hurled like children's toys. The very air turned solid, pressing against skin with the weight of a collapsing mountain. Inside the storm coffins, they couldn't see it, but they felt it. Their bones shook. The air grew hot and wet, difficult to swallow. And for the first time since the storm era began, they began to doubt the earth could protect them. Above ground, the hurricane tore at the landscape with surgical violence. It didn't rage, it hunted. It peeled back cliff sides. It scooped rivers into the air and flung them into canyons. It found the places they had hidden before and erased them. The wind had learned, and it no longer cared about balance. It wanted silence. Total, permanent silence. And when it had it, when there was nothing left to scream, to sway, to fight back, it left. Just like that. As if it had never been there at all. When the clan finally emerged, the world was wrong. Familiar trees were gone or ripped out by their roots, flung who knows where. The river had moved, literally shifted courses, carving through land that had never known water. Dead fish were scattered across the hills, as if the storm had tried to drown the sky. The air reeked of mud and rot and something else, something metallic and sharp. And then they saw the bodies, not humantha predators. A saber-toothed cat crushed beneath a collapsed tree. A vulture with wings twisted like broken sticks. Even the sky hunters hadn't been spared. And that's when the realization hit them all at once. The hurricane didn't just kill, it reset. Every rule they'd learned, where the safe paths were, which trees bore fruit, where the animals hunted, all of it was gone. The storm had rewritten the world like a cruel god tearing pages from their map. And so they did what no animal ever could. They adapted. They didn't wait for the land to tell them what it had become. They tested it, one by one. The hunters split into pairs and explored the wreckage. They didn't look for prey, they looked for patterns. Which trees had survived, which rocks had shifted, where the birds returned first, where the water pooled. Because if the world had reset, then so would they, but not blindly. They were storm survivors now. And surviving a hurricane wasn't just about hiding from it. It was about learning how to live in the ruins it left behind. The days that followed were a quiet war against the wind's aftermath, against hunger, and most of all, against confusion. Entire forests were missing, stripped so clean it looked like a giant had raked the land bare. Their usual prey deer, wild boar, vanished, and so the clan shifted tactics. They followed the birds, not because birds made good food, but because birds found food first. Where the scavengers circled, they found bloated carcasses lodged in treetops and tangled roots. Where the herons stood still, they found new water lakes born from the storm. And along these new floodlines, something even more precious appeared: tracks. Not animal ones, human. Another group had survived. Different clan, different symbols carved into their tools, but they had left behind signs, deliberate, cautious. A line of stones curved toward a rock shelf, twigs broken and arranged like arrows. It wasn't a trap, it was an invitation, or maybe a warning. The leader of the clan stared at the marks, his jaw tight. Another storm was coming, not from the sky, from other survivors. Because when nature resets the world, the greatest threat to your life isn't always the weather. It's what desperate people will do to stay alive in the world after. They followed the markers, not out of trust but necessity. Every direction held risk. West meant rotten earth and tangled roots. South was still underwater. East was where the hurricane had clawed the mountain open like a wound. North, the path of the symbols, was the only one that didn't stink of death. For 3 days they moved silently, every snapped branch and shifting shadow a reason to freeze. And then they saw it. A ridge of high rock untouched by flood, wind, or fire. Smoke curled gently from a hidden crevice halfway up. Not storm smoke, cooking smoke. They weren't alone. The leader held up a fist. Behind him, the clan dropped low. He pointed to 2 hunters, silent, fast, lawyer land. They melted into the brush to scout. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then the scream. It wasn't an attack. It was worse, warning. The scouts came tumbling back, blood streaking one's face. Not from a fight, from a trap. Simple but brutal, a snare laced with bone shards, designed not just to catch but to cripple. And beside the trap, the same symbols. Only this time, they weren't made of twigs. They were painted, in red, in blood, not a message, a boundary: turn back or bleed. And now the clan faced a choice worse than the hurricane. Face the storm of man, or try to survive the broken world alone. They turned back, not because they feared a fight, but because they'd learned something deeper. The storm hadn't just destroyed the land, it had fractured the people. Once, clans might have shared food, fire, knowledge. Now the world was a shattered map of territory and teeth. So they moved in silence, circling wide around the blood-marked ridge, venturing into a place none of them had ever dared go before: the hollow plains, a stretch of open earth where the wind never stopped. Trees didn't grow here, only thin, wiry grass and twisted stones. Old ones said the hollow plains were cursed, that thunder lived in the soil. But right now, curses were safer than men. The clan camped beneath an overhanging rock, using branches and animal hides to build a windbreaker. They cooked roots and bark and old dried meat. They didn't talk much, didn't need to, until the baby coughed. At first, just a tickle, but then again and again, and soon its tiny chest began to heave, desperate for air. The healer rushed over, cracking open a pouch of crushed herbs, trying to ease the breathing, but they all knew what it meant. The rot was setting in, not from infection, from the storm. The water that flooded the land had rotted everything it touched: fish, plants, lungs. The hurricane was gone, but it had left poison in the wind. And now, the clan had no choice. They would have to go back into the forest, back toward other survivors, toward the risk of attack or salvation. Because one truth was becoming terrifyingly clear: the storm may have passed, But the danger had only just begun. They moved at dawn, no fire, no sounds. Just the crunch of damp leaves beneath leather-wrapped feet. The baby was swaddled in fur, pressed to its mother's chest. Every cough from its tiny lungs echoed like thunder inside their minds. They didn't speak of it, but each step forward felt like a countdown. The hollow plains behind them, the flooded forest ahead, and somewhere in between, other clans, strays, desperate wanderers, or worse. They followed the river upstream, where the current had carved a path clear of debris. Trees lay shattered on both sides, stripped of bark, roots twisted to the sky like claws. The water was no longer brown. It was dark, thick, slow. They passed a half-buried skeleton near the shore. Not animal, human. The healer stopped to examine it. The bones were scorched, not by fire but by something caustic, something chemical. A new kind of horror was setting in. The storm hadn't just brought wind and rain. It brought transformation. Plants were dying from the roots up. Mushrooms bloomed where none had before, white, luminous, weeping a strange liquid. The animals that survived were twitchy, pale, eyes clouded. A dead deer with blistered skin lay in their path, untouched by scavengers. "Don't step in the water," the elder whispered. "Even the river's gone strange." They pressed on, and that's when they saw it. A structure. Not a cave. Not a tree. A wall. Stone slabs stacked with purpose, wide enough to block the path, tall enough to force a detour, blackened by smoke, fresh. Someone or something had built it. Recently, the clan stopped. Their breathing caught. Beyond the wall, the air looked thicker, the light dimmer, the wind stopped. The baby stirred again, coughed once, then fell still. They didn't have time to mourn, because a sound rose from behind the wall. Not thunder, not wind. Footsteps. And they were getting closer. The first foot stepped into view, not bare, wrapped tightly in sinew and bark, laced with dried vines coated in ash. Then came the rest of him. Tall, gaunt, eyes like empty pits. Not one of them. Not a clansman. Not even a man. The figure stared through them, past them, as if they weren't prey but trespassers. Behind him, more emerged from the haze. Not many, just enough. They didn't speak, didn't scream. They watched. The wind picked up again, twisting low along the dirt, like it was alive, whistling through the broken trees, tugging at the furs around the children's feet. The clan elder stepped forward, arm raised, not in threat, but in recognition. A moment passed. Then the figures turned, one by one, disappearing into the mist behind the wall like smoke. And just like that, they were gone. But the message was clear. This place was claimed. This storm had created new gods, new rules, new kings. The clan turned away. They wouldn't speak of what they saw, not to the children, not even to each other. They found another cave by nightfall, dry, hidden. The entrance choked with fallen stone, but manageable. There, in silence, they laid down what little they carried. Flint, fur, bone tools now slick with mud. The baby's mother sat at the edge of the firelight, unmoving. The healer crushed herbs in the corner, whispering old words. The elder carved a mark into the wall, just one. A spiral, cracked at the edges, a warning for whoever came next. Outside, the hurricane's tail still swept across the horizon. Trees swayed like dancers with broken limbs. The stars blinked once, then disappeared behind new clouds. And inside, wrapped in silence, the last survivors of the storm prepared for sleep. Tomorrow, the world would be different, again. But for tonight, they had a wall, a fire, and the memory of what they'd escaped. And in a world ruled by storms, sometimes survival was the greatest story of all.